Why bother talking to her? She can't hear you anyway. The cruel words sliced through the glossy penthouse office of Langston and Wells, where chandeliers gleamed and suits cost more than rent. The black receptionist, a quiet woman overlooked in her role as front desk staff, froze mid-gesture. She endured daily slights, whispers about her accent, snickers at her simple lunch, assumptions she was just a diversity hire. Yet in that moment, she knelt before the CEO's deaf mother, signing a warm greeting that lit up the old woman's face. Her grace silenced the room, catching the CEO's eye. Would her kindness shift her fate in a world built to ignore her? If you love stories of courage and unexpected love, subscribe to our latest videos and share where you're watching from. What did she say to change everything? Stick around to find out. The air in the Langston and Wells penthouse office was thick with ambition, sharp as the edge of a polished blade. Crystal chandeliers cast prisms across Italian marble floors, and every click of a heel or rustle of a tailored suit screamed power. Men in cufflinks worth more than cars murmured about mergers, while women in stilettos glided past with smiles that hid daggers. At the heart of this gleaming empire sat Clara, the black receptionist, her presence as unremarkable to the room as the potted fern by the elevator. Her desk, a modest island in the sea of opulence, was where she spent her days, greeting clients, sorting mail, and swallowing the sting of being overlooked. Her soft-spoken voice, tinged with an accent that marked her as other, drew smirks from colleagues who assumed she'd learned her manners from some corner of the internet, rather than a life of quiet resilience. Clara's mornings were a ritual of invisibility. She arrived early, her lunch, a sandwich wrapped in foil, tucked in her bag, a stark contrast to the catered trays of artisanal pastries that fueled the office. "Diversity hire," a junior analyst had whispered once, loud enough for her to hear, as if her degree and years of grit meant nothing next to her skin and heritage. Another time, a senior VP had chuckled, "Nice effort, but your accent's a bit exotic for client calls." She'd smiled, nodded, and buried the ache, just as she did every day when someone forgot her name or assumed she was the intern. But Clara had learned long ago from her grandmother's steady hands that dignity wasn't something others could take. It was something you carried. On this particular morning, the office buzzed with an unusual tension. Word had spread that Elizabeth Langston, the mother of CEO Victor Langston, was visiting. The staff straightened their postures, their voices dropping to hushed tones, as if royalty were descending. Victor was a figure who commanded reverence and fear in equal measure. 30 years old, with storm-gray eyes and a reputation for running his multi-billion-dollar empire like a chess grandmaster. His mother, though, was a mystery. Frail, elegant, and deaf since childhood, Elizabeth rarely appeared. And when she did, most treated her like a fragile heirloom, admired from a distance, but never engaged. Clara was sorting emails when the glass doors swung open. Elizabeth Langston entered in a wheelchair, her silver hair swept into a chignon, her hands folded delicately in her lap. The room froze, but not out of respect. A senior executive, mid-sip of his espresso, muttered, "Why bother talking to her? She can't hear you anyway." A ripple of laughter followed, not loud, but sharp enough to cut. Clara's fingers paused on her keyboard. She glanced at Elizabeth, whose eyes, bright and knowing, scanned the room as if searching for something human. The executives turned away, their attention drifting back to their screens, dismissing the old woman as if she were part of the decor. Clara's heart thudded. She remembered her grandmother, a woman who'd taught her American Sign Language, ASL, not just as a skill, but as a way to see the unseen. "Kindness is a language louder than words," her grandmother had said, her hands moving like poetry. Clara stood smoothing her modest skirt and walked toward Elizabeth. The room didn't notice at first. Her steps were too quiet, her presence too unassuming. She knelt beside the wheelchair, her dark eyes meeting Elizabeth's pale ones, and signed with deliberate grace. "Good morning, Mrs. Langston. Are you well? You look radiant today." The words, unspoken yet vivid, hung in the air. Elizabeth's face transformed, a smile breaking through like sunlight after a storm. Her hands, trembling slightly from age, signed back. Thank you, dear. It's been a while since anyone said that. The exchange was brief, but it was as if Clara had struck a gong in a silent cathedral. Heads turned. Conversation stalled. A junior assistant whispered, "How does she know sign language? Some YouTube crash course?" Another scoffed, "Probably just showing off." The words were laced with the casual cruelty of assumption, implying Clara's skill was a fluke, not a product of her heritage or effort. Victor Langston stood 3 meters away, his presence a gravitational force. He'd been reviewing a contract with his CFO, but now his eyes were fixed on Clara. At 30, he was a man who moved through the world like a storm, unpredictable, commanding, and untouchable. His tailored suit hugged his frame, and his gaze, sharp as flint, made people straighten their spines. But in that moment he was still, his expression unreadable. Clara hadn't noticed him at first, too focused on Elizabeth's radiant smile. She rose, her cheeks warm, not from embarrassment, but from the shame others should have felt for their indifference. The room resumed its hum, but Victor stepped forward, his polished shoes silent on the marble. The air shifted, as if the oxygen had been sucked out. "What did you say to her?" His voice wasn't loud, but it carried a weight that demanded an answer. Deep, edged with something that wasn't quite anger, but wasn't soft either. Clara's pulse raced. She met his eyes, storm gray and piercing, and answered quietly, "I said she was well and looked radiant." Victor blinked just once, his gaze flicking to his mother, whose smile hadn't faded. Elizabeth signed something back, her hands slow but deliberate. Clara translated softly, "She says it's the first time in months anyone's spoken to her like that." The silence that followed was deafening. You could have heard a pin drop on the marble. Clara lowered her eyes, her hands clasped tightly. She hadn't meant to stand out. She never did. But the weight of every gaze in the room pressed against her, some curious, others judgmental. A marketing associate muttered behind her coffee mug, "Why would she even learn that? Trying to score points?" The words stung, not just for their dismissal of her skill, but for the unspoken assumption that someone like her, black, with an accent, couldn't possibly have depth beyond her role. Victor's voice cut through again, low and deliberate. "Clara." She looked up, startled, her name in his mouth sounding both foreign and intimate. "Join us." The room gasped. His assistant, a woman with a clipboard and a perpetually pinched expression, stumbled over her words. "Sir, she's just the receptionist." Victor didn't repeat himself. He didn't need to. Elizabeth, still smiling, reached for Clara's hand, her grip surprisingly strong. It was decided. As Clara followed Victor and Elizabeth toward the boardroom, her borrowed blazer felt too tight, her flats too plain among the sea of designer heels. The elevator ride was silent, but Victor's gaze flicked toward her once, twice, as if trying to unravel a puzzle he hadn't expected to encounter. Clara stood at the back, her heart pounding, aware of the whispers that would follow. She wasn't just stepping into a meeting, she was stepping into a world that had never seen her, and it terrified her as much as it thrilled her. This wasn't just about signing a greeting, it was about daring to be seen in a place that thrived on rendering people like her invisible. Clara didn't know it yet, but that single act of kindness had cracked open a door, one that led to a future she'd never dared imagine. For now, though, she clutched her courage like a lifeline, ready to face whatever came next. The boardroom of Langston and Wells was a fortress of glass and steel, its long mahogany table reflecting the city skyline, like a mirror. Clara stood at the edge, her hands clasped tightly, feeling the weight of every eye in the room. The air was heavy with the scent of coffee and ambition, as investors in tailored suits leaned forward, their gazes sharp and expectant. Victor Langston sat at the head, his presence commanding silence without effort, his storm-gray eyes scanning documents with surgical precision. His mother, Elizabeth, sat beside him, her wheelchair positioned just outside the circle of power, her hands folded calmly in her lap. Clara, still in her borrowed blazer, felt like an intruder in this world of wealth and whispered deals. Her role as receptionist now stretched impossibly into translator for a woman no one else dared to engage. The meeting was about a multi-million-dollar acquisition, a deal that could redefine the company's reach. Victor's voice was steady as he outlined terms, his words clipped and confident, but the investor's questions came fast, probing for weaknesses. Clara's job was simple yet daunting. Interpret Elizabeth's silent contributions, her signed insights that Victor had insisted be included. The old woman's eyes were sharp, missing nothing, and Clara felt a quiet kinship with her, a shared understanding of being seen yet unseen. As the discussion heated up, an investor, a man with a voice like gravel, pressed Victor on a clause buried deep in the contract, one that could cost the company millions if overlooked. Victor's jaw tightened, his response measured but uncertain. Clara caught Elizabeth's subtle gesture, a flicker of her hands that most in the room missed. She leaned closer, her heart racing, and watched as Elizabeth signed with deliberate clarity. The clause is a trap. It locks us into unfavorable terms after year 3. Clara hesitated, her pulse loud in her ears. Speaking up meant drawing every eye, risking ridicule in a room that already viewed her as an anomaly. But Elizabeth's gaze held hers, steady and encouraging, as if to say, "You are enough." Clara cleared her throat, her voice soft but clear. "Mrs. Langston says the clause is a trap. It locks the company into unfavorable terms after the 3rd year." The room stilled. Victor's eyes snapped to Clara, then to his mother, who nodded once, her expression unyielding. The investor's face reddened, his pen tapping the table like a metronome. "And how would she know?" he asked, his tone dripping with condescension, as if a deaf woman or a receptionist couldn't possibly grasp the stakes. Clara translated Elizabeth's response. "I've read every contract this company has signed since my husband founded it. I know a bad deal when I see one." A murmur rippled through the room, not of laughter this time, but of reluctant respect. Victor's lips twitched, a rare hint of a smile, and he redirected the discussion, sidestepping the clause with a deftness that saved the deal. As the meeting adjourned, the investors filed out, their murmurs now laced with curiosity about the receptionist who'd turned the tide. Clara exhaled, her hands trembling as she gathered her notes. She'd done it, not just translated, but bridged a gap no one else had bothered to cross. But the victory was short-lived. In the hallway, Helena Clark, the chief communications officer, leaned against a glass wall, her sleek blonde hair catching the light. Her smile was sharp, like a blade wrapped in silk. "Impressive performance," she said, her voice low, "but don't think this makes you one of us. People like you don't climb this high without a catch." Clara's stomach twisted. The words weren't new. She'd heard variations before, from the colleague who'd called her accent unfit for clients, to the manager who'd assumed she was only hired to check a box. But Helena's tone carried a personal venom, as if Clara's moment in the boardroom had crossed an invisible line. "I'm just doing my job," Clara said quietly, her eyes on the floor. Helena stepped closer, her heels clicking like a warning. "Your job, or is it cozying up to the Langstons? I saw how you played the hero in there. Convenient, isn't it? Knowing just the right signs to make yourself indispensable?" The accusation landed like a slap, implying Clara's skill in ASL was a calculated ploy, not a gift honed through years of love for her grandmother. Clara's cheeks burned, but she held her ground, her voice steady. "I learned sign language to speak to people, not to play games." Helena's eyes narrowed, but before she could respond, Victor appeared, his presence silencing the hallway. "Helena, the press release needs your attention," he said, his tone clipped. She nodded, casting Clara one last look before turning away. That evening, alone at her desk, Clara opened her email. The whispers had already spread, colleagues exchanging glances, a junior assistant muttering, "She's got to be after something, right? Nobody learns sign language for fun." The words echoed Helena's, each one a reminder that her presence, her skill, her very existence in this space was suspect because of who she was. Clara's fingers hovered over her keyboard, drafting an email to Victor. "Mr. Langston," she wrote, "I appreciate the opportunity to assist today, but I don't want to cause any trouble for your mother or the company. I'd like to step back from translating." Her cursor blinked, the words blurring as tears pricked her eyes. She didn't want to quit. She loved helping Elizabeth, Loved the way the old woman's hands told stories words couldn't. But the weight of being seen as a schemer was too much. She hesitated, her finger hovering over the send button. The office was quiet now, the city lights glittering through the windows. Clara thought of her grandmother, who'd faced her own share of slights, yet never stopped signing, never stopped listening with her heart. Deleting the email, Clara closed her laptop. She wasn't ready to give up, not yet. But as she stepped into the elevator, she overheard two colleagues in the lobby. "She's clever, I'll give her that," one said. "Playing the sympathy card with the old lady? Smart move for someone like her." The other laughed. "Yeah, but she's still just the receptionist. This won't last." Clara's chest tightened, but she kept walking, her flat silent on the marble. The city air hit her face as she stepped outside, cool and sharp, a reminder that she was still here, still standing. Back in the office, Victor sat in his office, the glow of his computer casting shadows across his face. He'd seen the way Clara had carried herself in the boardroom, poised, unflinching, despite the room's unspoken judgments. He'd also seen Helena's venom, the way her words had made Clara shrink, if only for a moment. His fingers tapped his desk, his mind turning over a decision he hadn't expected to face. Clara wasn't just a receptionist. She was a force, one he wasn't ready to let slip away. The next morning, Clara arrived to find a note on her desk, written in Victor's precise handwriting. "Your help yesterday was invaluable. Stay on as my mother's translator. This isn't a request." Clara's breath caught. The note was both a lifeline and a challenge, pulling her deeper into a world that didn't want her. She glanced at Elizabeth, who was waiting in the lobby, her smile warm and expectant. Clara signed a quick greeting, and Elizabeth's hands moved in response. "You did well, dear. Don't let them dim your light." Clara nodded, her resolve hardening. She didn't know what lay ahead, but for now she'd keep signing, keep speaking, keep being the bridge no one else dared to build. The grand ballroom of the Langston and Wells annual gala shimmered under a constellation of chandeliers, each crystal catching the light like a star. The air was thick with the scent of champagne and roses, and the soft hum of a string quartet wove through the laughter of the elite. Men in black tie and women in gowns that swept the floor moved with calculated grace, their smiles as polished as the marble beneath their feet. Clara stood near the edge of the room, her simple navy dress, a thrift store find altered by her own hands, feeling like a whisper against the roar of couture. The invitation to the gala had arrived on her desk, unsigned but embossed with the company seal, and though she'd hesitated, Elizabeth's warm smile had convinced her to attend. Now, surrounded by wealth and whispers, she felt like a shadow in a spotlight. The gala was more than a party. It was a stage where alliances were forged and reputations cemented. Clara clutched a glass of sparkling water, her fingers cold against the flute, acutely aware of the eyes that skimmed past her. She was the receptionist, the anomaly who dared to step into their world, and the room hadn't forgotten it. A group of executives nearby laughed too loudly, their glances flicking toward her before darting away. "She looks out of place," one murmured, his voice low but not low enough. "Probably here for the photo op," another added, her lips curling as if Clara's presence was a minor scandal. The words stung, echoing the casual slights she'd endured for months, the assumption her skills were a gimmick, the insinuation her heritage made her less. Clara's gaze drifted to the dance floor, where couples swayed in perfect rhythm. No one approached her, no one offered a hand. She was used to being invisible at the front desk, but here, under the glittering lights, the isolation felt sharper, like a blade pressed against her skin. She sipped her water, willing herself to stay, to prove she could belong, if only for one night. Then she saw Helena Clark across the room, her crimson gown clinging to her like a second skin, her blonde hair swept into an elegant updo. Helena's eyes locked onto Clara's, and a smile curved her lips, not warm, but predatory. Clara's stomach churned. She'd seen that look before, in the hallway after the boardroom triumph, when Helena had accused her of scheming. Moments later, a murmur rippled through the crowd. Heads turned toward a massive screen above the bar, where a photo flickered into view. A candid shot of Clara and Victor at a quiet cafe. their heads bent close over coffee, her smile soft and his eyes warm. The caption beneath it was Poison, Receptionist or Rising Star. How she caught the CEO's eye. The room buzzed, whispers turning into a low roar. "So that's her game," a woman in pearls said, loud enough for Clara to hear. "Using the old lady to get to him? Clever for someone like her." The words cut deep, laced with the assumption that Clara's kindness, her skill, her very presence was a calculated move to climb a ladder she didn't belong on. Clara's breath caught, her glass trembling in her hand. She wanted to run, to slip through the crowd and out into the night where no one could see her. The photo wasn't scandalous, but the implication was clear. She was an outsider, a black woman with an accent, who dared to step too close to power. She set her glass down, her legs unsteady, and took a step toward the exit. Then a voice cut through the noise, low and deliberate. "Clara." Victor stood before her, his black tuxedo unbuttoned at the collar, his storm gray eyes locking onto hers. The room seemed to shrink, the whispers fading under the weight of his presence. He extended his hand, his voice steady. "Dance with me." The ballroom fell silent, as if the air itself held its breath. Clara froze, her heart pounding. Every eye was on them. Executives, investors, Helena, whose smile had vanished. To refuse would be to admit defeat, to confirm the whispers that she didn't belong. To accept was to step into a spotlight she'd never sought. She looked at Victor, his hand steady, his gaze unwavering, and something in her shifted. She wasn't just the receptionist tonight. She was Clara, the woman who'd learned to speak in silence, who'd carried her grandmother's lessons into a world that didn't want her. She placed her hand in his, her fingers trembling, but her chin high. The quartet struck up a waltz, its notes soft and haunting. Victor led her to the center of the dance floor, his hand firm at her waist, guiding her with a confidence that made the room blur. Clara had never danced like this, not in a place where every step was judged, but she followed his lead, her movements tentative at first, then steadier. The crowd watched, some with curiosity, others with barely concealed disdain. "She doesn't even know how to waltz properly," a woman muttered, her voice tinged with the same condescension Clara had heard all her life. "What's he thinking? Parading her like that?" Another whispered, the words a reminder that her presence, her skin, her very existence was a disruption. Victor's hand tightened slightly, as if sensing her tension. "Ignore them," he said, his voice low, meant only for her. "You're here because you deserve to be." Clara met his eyes, searching for a motive, but found only sincerity. For the first time she felt seen, not as a receptionist, not as a token, but as herself. The dance was more than a moment. It was a declaration, a line drawn in the sand. As they moved, the whispers grew fainter, the chandeliers above casting light that seemed to wrap them in a world of their own. When the music slowed, Victor didn't let go immediately. He leaned closer, his breath warm against her ear. "You saved that meeting. You don't owe them an apology for existing." Clara's throat tightened, her resolve wavering under the weight of his words. She wanted to believe him, but the photo, the whispers, Helena's venom, they were all reminders of how fragile her place was. As they stepped apart, the crowd parted, and Clara caught Helena's gaze across the room. The other woman's face was a mask of fury, her eyes promising retribution. Clara's heart sank, but she held her head high, refusing to shrink. As the gala continued, Clara slipped to a quiet corner, her hands still trembling from the dance. Elizabeth wheeled over, her smile radiant despite the room's tension. She signed, her hands slow but clear. "You were brave out there. Don't let them steal that." Clara nodded, her eyes stinging. She wanted to stay brave, to hold on to the fire Victor's hand had kindled, but the whispers followed her, each one a reminder of the world she was up against. A young assistant approached, hesitating before offering a shy smile. "You looked amazing out there," she said, her voice genuine. "I didn't think you'd dance with him." Clara managed a small smile. "Neither did I." The night wore on, but Clara felt the weight of every glance, every muttered comment. The photo had turned her into a story she hadn't written, and Helena's shadow loomed larger than ever. As she left the ballroom, the city air cool against her skin, Clara knew this wasn't the end. The dance had changed something, not just in her, but in the way Victor saw her, and the way the world would try to tear her down. She wasn't sure what came next, but for now, she carried the memory of that waltz, a fleeting moment of defiance in a room that wanted her to disappear. The private lounge at Langston and Wells was a sanctuary of muted elegance, its soft lighting casting golden hues across velvet armchairs and a low oak table. Clara sat across from Elizabeth Langston, the air between them warm with the scent of chamomile tea and freshly baked scones. The older woman's shawl, threaded with gold, draped over her shoulders like a quiet crown, her hands steady as she signed with a grace that belied her frailty. Clara's navy dress, still the same one from the gala, felt less out of place here, in this intimate space where power took a backseat to presence. The gala's whispers still echoed in her mind. Helena's venom, the photo that painted her as a schemer, but Elizabeth's invitation to this meeting had been a lifeline, a chance to breathe away from the spotlight. Elizabeth's eyes, sharp and kind, held Clara's as she reached into a small velvet pouch and produced a silver hairpin shaped like a lily. She placed it in Clara's palm, her hands signing slowly. "This belonged to a friend who changed my life with her kindness. You remind me of her." Clara's fingers closed around the cool metal, her throat tightening. The gesture was more than a gift. It was a recognition of something deeper, a connection forged in silence. "Thank you," Clara said softly, her voice catching. "I don't know what to say." Elizabeth's smile widened, her hands moving again. "You don't need to say anything. You already speak my language." Their conversation was interrupted by the sharp click of heels. Helena Clark stood in the doorway, her crimson lipstick a stark contrast to the coldness in her eyes. "Mrs. Langston, I need a moment," she said, her voice clipped, ignoring Clara as if she were furniture. Elizabeth's expression didn't waver, but her hand signed a quick dismissal. "Later." Helena's jaw tightened, her gaze flicking to Clara with a resentment that felt personal, almost primal. "This is important," Helena pressed, but Elizabeth's hands were firm. "Not now." Helena turned on her heel, her exit as sharp as her entrance, leaving a chill in the room. Clara's heart raced. She'd felt Helena's hostility before, but this was different, less calculated, more raw. She wanted to ask Elizabeth about it, but the older woman's hands moved again, redirecting her thoughts. "You've been brave, Clara, but bravery comes with enemies." Clara nodded, the hairpin heavy in her hand. She'd never sought enemies, only a chance to be seen for who she was. Yet the gala had shifted something, and Helena's actions, the photo, the whispers, were a warning that Clara's presence was a threat to someone's carefully guarded world. Later that day, in the quiet of the office, Clara was called to Victor's office. The room was a study in power, floor-to-ceiling windows, a desk that could double as a fortress, and Victor himself, leaning back in his chair, his storm-gray eyes unreadable. "Sit," he said, his voice low but not unkind. Clara perched on the edge of a leather chair, the hairpin tucked in her pocket like a talisman. "My mother trusts you," Victor began, his fingers tapping the desk. "That's rare." Clara met his gaze, her voice steady despite the nerves. "I'm honored. I just want to help her." Victor leaned forward, his eyes searching hers. "You've done more than help. You've given her something this company hasn't in years. Dignity." Clara's breath caught, the weight of his words settling in her chest. But before she could respond, the door opened, and Helena stormed in, a folder clutched in her manicured hands. "We need to talk," she said, her voice sharp, directed at Victor, but slicing through Clara. "Now." Victor's expression hardened, but he nodded. "Clara, stay." Helena's eyes flashed with fury, but she didn't argue. She slammed the folder onto the desk, papers spilling out, a birth certificate, a faded photograph, and a handwritten letter. "This is why I've been fighting," she said, her voice trembling with something deeper than anger. "I'm your father's daughter, Victor. His other daughter." The room froze. Clara's pulse pounded, her eyes darting between the documents and Helena's face, now stripped of its usual polish. The photograph showed a young woman, strikingly similar to Helena, standing beside a man who could only be Victor's father. The birth certificate confirmed it. Helena Clark, born out of wedlock, hidden from the Langston legacy. Victor's face was a mask, but his hands gripped the desk, knuckles white. "Why now?" he asked, his voice dangerously calm. Helena's laugh was bitter. "Because I've spent my life in the shadows, watching people like her," she gestured at Clara, "waltz in and take what I've earned." Clara's chest tightened, the accusation laced with the same venom she'd heard before. The assumption that her presence was an intrusion, her kindness a ploy. "I'm not taking anything," Clara said quietly, her voice steady. "I'm here for Mrs. Langston, not for power." Helena's eyes narrowed, but Victor cut in, his voice sharp. "Enough. This isn't about Clara." He picked up the birth certificate, his eyes scanning it with the precision of a man who'd built an empire on details. This should have been handled years ago, privately. Helena's shoulders sagged, the fight draining from her. "I just wanted to be seen," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Not as the mistake, but as family." Clara's heart ached, not for Helena's cruelty, but for the pain beneath it. She understood what it meant to be unseen, to fight for a place in a world that dismissed you. "I don't want your place," Clara said, her voice soft but firm. "I just want people like Mrs. Langston to be heard. People like us, who get overlooked." Helena's eyes met hers, not with warmth, but with a flicker of recognition, as if Clara's words had pierced the armor she'd worn for years. Victor stood, his presence filling the room. "This will be handled legally," he said, his tone final. "You'll get what's yours, Helena, but not like this." He turned to Clara, his eyes softening just enough to notice. "Thank you for staying." Clara nodded, her hand brushing the hairpin in her pocket. She hadn't expected to be here, in the heart of a family secret, but she felt the weight of Elizabeth's trust, the strength of her own resolve. As Helena left, her heels no longer clicking with authority, but with something heavier, Clara felt the room shift. Victor sat back down, his gaze distant. "My father never spoke of her," he said almost to himself, "but my mother knew." Clara's mind flashed to Elizabeth's steady hands, her knowing smile. "She sees more than people think," Clara said. Victor nodded, a rare vulnerability in his eyes. "So do you." That evening, Clara sat alone in her apartment, the hairpin on her bedside table, its lily shape catching the lamplight. She thought of her grandmother, who taught her that kindness was a rebellion against a world that tried to make you small. Helena's revelation had shaken her, not because of the secret, but because it mirrored her own fight. To be seen as more than a receptionist, more than a black woman with an accent others mocked. She didn't want Helena's inheritance or Victor's empire. She wanted what she'd always wanted, a voice for those who'd been silenced. The next morning, Clara returned to the office, the hairpin clipped in her hair. Elizabeth was waiting in the lobby, her smile as warm as ever. She signed, "It suits you." Clara touched the pin, her heart steady. She didn't know what battles lay ahead, but she knew she'd face them, not for power, but for the people who needed her most. Helena's shadow still lingered, but Clara's light, kindled by a single act of courage, was growing brighter. The morning of the press conference at Langston and Wells dawned gray, the city cloaked in a mist that softened the edges of its steel towers. Inside the office, the lobby buzzed with a quiet anticipation, the usual whispers replaced by a hum of curiosity. Clara stood behind her desk, her navy dress swapped for a tailored blazer she'd saved months to afford, the lily-shaped hairpin gleaming in her hair. The weight of the past weeks, Helena's revelation, the gala's spotlight, the photo that had painted her as an opportunist, still lingered, but today felt different. The air carried a promise of change, as if the world was holding its breath for something new. Clara's fingers brushed the edge of her desk, her grandmother's words echoing in her mind. "Kindness is a rebellion, Clara. Never let them make you small." The press conference was modest by Langston standards, held in a sleek conference room with a single podium and a backdrop of the company logo. Reporters filled the seats, their notebooks open, cameras ready. Victor stood at the podium, his black suit crisp, but his collar slightly loosened, a hint of the man beneath the CEO. Elizabeth sat to his side, her dove-gray shawl catching the light, her smile warm as she signed a greeting to Clara, who stood nearby, ready to translate if needed. The room was a far cry from the gala's opulence, but its energy was electric, a moment where words could reshape futures. Victor's voice was steady as he addressed the crowd. Langston and Wells has always been about innovation, he began, his storm-gray eyes scanning the room. But innovation isn't just about profit, it's about people. Today we're launching a fund to train every employee in American Sign Language, inspired by my mother, Elizabeth Langston, and by someone who reminded us what it means to listen. He paused, his gaze finding Clara's. Someone who showed us that true leadership starts with seeing those who are overlooked. The room stirred, cameras flashing as reporters scribbled notes. Clara's cheeks warmed, but she kept her posture straight, her hands still. She hadn't expected to be mentioned, hadn't wanted the spotlight, but Victor's words carried a weight that silenced the doubts in her mind. The fund wasn't just a gesture, it was a commitment to change, a ripple from the moment she'd knelt to sign to Elizabeth. A reporter raised a hand, her question sharp but curious. Mr. Langston, what prompted this initiative? Was it a response to recent events? Victor's lips twitched, not quite a smile. It was a response to seeing what matters. My mother taught me that, and so did someone else. Clara's heart thudded, but she kept her focus on Elizabeth, who signed, He's learning. Clara nodded, a small smile breaking through. The conference ended with a quiet applause, the reporters filing out, their chatter now laced with respect rather than skepticism. As the room emptied, a junior colleague, a young man who'd once snickered at her lunch, approached Clara hesitantly. I was wrong about you, he said, his voice low. I thought you didn't belong here, but you've changed how we see things. Thanks. Clara's throat tightened, but she managed a nod. Just doing what feels right, she said, her voice steady. That evening, Clara and Victor found themselves in the office kitchen, a small, overlooked space with flickering fluorescent lights and a single table. Victor had insisted on staying late to review the press release, and Clara had offered to help, her translator role now a quiet partnership. The city outside was draped in a gentle rain, the sound a soft patter against the windows. Victor pulled 2 mugs from a cabinet, his movements surprisingly domestic for a man who commanded billions. Soup? He asked, holding up a can of tomato soup, his eyebrow raised in a rare moment of playfulness. Clara laughed, the sound easing the tension in her chest. Only if it's like my grandmother's, she said, taking the can. They worked side by side, heating the soup on a small stove, the steam curling around them like a shared secret. As they sat at the table, mugs steaming, Clara broke the silence. Why the fund? She asked, her voice soft but curious. Victor leaned back, his eyes tracing the raindrops on the window. Because I saw my mother smile again. Because you showed me what I'd been missing, not just in her, but in everyone we ignore. Clara's spoon paused, her heart catching at the honesty in his voice. The soup was simple, its warmth a reminder of childhood nights when her grandmother would make the same recipe, humming as she stirred. Clara shared the memory, her voice soft. She used to say a good meal could fix anything, even a bad day. Victor's gaze softened, his usual intensity giving way to something warmer. Your grandmother sounds like someone I'd have liked to meet. Clara smiled, her fingers brushing the hairpin. She'd have liked you too, but she'd have made you eat more. Their laughter filled the small space, a moment of ease in a world that had been anything but. As they cleaned up, the rain grew heavier, a steady drum against the glass. Victor offered to drive her home, but Clara shook her head, pulling her coat tight. I like the rain, she said, stepping toward the door. He followed her outside, the city lights blurred by the downpour. They stood under the office awning, the air cool and charged. Victor's hand brushed hers, tentative, then deliberate. Clara, he said, his voice low, you've changed more than this company. You've changed me. Before she could respond, he leaned in, his lips meeting hers in a kiss that was steady, gentle, like a promise made in the quiet of a storm. The rain fell around them, soaking her coat, but Clara didn't care. The kiss wasn't urgent, wasn't a performance. It was real, a moment of connection that felt infinite. When they pulled apart, neither spoke, their eyes saying enough. Clara's heart was full, not just of him, but of the strength she'd found in herself. Back in her apartment, Clara found a small box tucked in her bag, a gift from Elizabeth, delivered by a courier. Inside was a letter, written in her grandmother's careful script, one Clara had kept but hadn't read in years. Kindness is your strength, Clara. It's the loudest voice in a world that tries to silence you. She pressed the letter to her chest, tears pricking her eyes. The hairpin gleamed on her nightstand, a reminder of the women who'd shaped her grandmother, Elizabeth, and now herself. The next day, Clara returned to her desk, the office quieter, the glances softer. A colleague, the same one who'd once mocked her accent, left a coffee on her desk with a note. "You're changing things. Keep going." Clara smiled, her resolve firm. She wasn't here for power or applause. She was here for the people who'd been overlooked, for the voices that needed to be heard. The rain had stopped, but its memory lingered, a reminder that even in a storm, she could stand tall. What did Clara's journey teach you? Her courage to speak in silence, to stand tall against whispers and doubt, reminds us that kindness can shift the world. Did her story resonate with you? Maybe it sparked a memory of a time you felt unseen, or a moment you dared to be heard. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Share them in the comments and let us know where you're tuning in from. Your voice matters, just like Clara's. If her story moved you, hit that subscribe button to catch more tales of heart and resilience. Thank you for joining us on this journey through Langston and Wells, where a single act of compassion rewrote the rules. We're grateful for every second you spent with us and can't wait to bring you another story that stirs the soul. See you next time. Keep listening, keep shining.